This is Steve Dale here, and we're recording this on May 20th of 2025 here. And what we're here to talk about is the process of creating a customized plan for a person with a disability with the Dale Law Firm. Before we get started, I want to make a real special introduction. We've recently had a lot of growth at the Dale Law Firm and have added a couple of great associates. And one that I want to introduce you to is Diana Quigley, who heads up our estate planning team at the Dale Law Firm here. And she's going to be a key part of this presentation. Diana, and I'll just do a brief introduction. While she's new to the Dale Law Firm, she is not new to estate planning. Diana, how long have you been doing estate planning?
A little over 5 years now.
Okay. And the other thing is that Diana also has just completed her LLM in estate planning. So now we actually have three attorneys with LLMs. What is an LLM in estate planning?
I was just
Why
gonna
should oh,
say,
that's a hard
yeah, it's
question.
a master's in law. So similar to when doctors, after they complete their residency, they'll do a fellowship to get a specialty education. Similar to that, it's a specialty education specifically in estate planning.
Okay. And so this is, by the way, this is our first presentation together. Hopefully it'll go really well here, but we'll just have to see how that goes. So with that, we need to keep in mind that this is for educational purpose only, and this couldn't be more relevant than it is today. Laws concerning benefits and their application are subject to change, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but as we are recording this, here, there are some changes to Medi-Cal eligibility coming up. And that just kind of illustrates the reason to have a plan that is flexible because changes happen. So today's objectives here, you know, are that our objective is to share with you how we do our planning at the Dale Law Firm and a process we've developed to design a plan for a person with a disability to enhance their quality of life and adjust to changes that are inevitable over a beneficiary's lifetime. Now, in getting into this, we're going to, and here in so one thing that is unique about the Dale Law Firm is that our entire focus is on creating and administering trust-based plans that are designed to enhance the quality of life for a person with a disability and their support system. When you're engaging the Dale Law Firm, you're engaging the knowledge and the experience of the entire law firm. So you're just seeing two parts of the firm here with Diana and I today. But once again, we have a whole team of staff that work on intakes and administration and support and all of that. And so our entire focus is working on plans focused on assisting persons with disabilities and their support systems and families to create a plan that can enhance quality of life. Diana, who heads our estate planning practice, and her team work on every case together. And part of what we really try to do is recognize that each person we plan for is a unique individual, and we work with the family or the person with a disability, create a unique plan to meet their unique needs. As I like to say, it would be really much simpler if all persons with disabilities had the same needs, but that simply isn't how it works. So with that, what we want to talk about is unique planning, and we want to focus on that benefits is should never be the entire focus. But on the other hand, it's hard to talk about a trust that keeps folks qualified for public benefits without talking about public benefits. So what we're going to focus on today is how to create a trust that enhances quality of life for a person with a disability and not just on preservation of benefits. But let's just go over a brief overview of the rules, and that will make the mechanics of how the trust works a lot simpler. If we look at public benefits, looking at this slide, we can divide them into two categories. The first category is what's called the needs-based benefits. And that includes programs like SSI and Medi-Cal. So what's similar with those programs is you have to show a need based on disability as well as limited income and resources. Now, compare that with the entitlements, and the programs we're going to touch on are on SSDI and Social Security retirement. And what's common with those programs here, especially for the SSDI, is that you have to show that you meet the definition of disability, but income and resources actually don't matter. What we're going to see with that is tied to that is Medicare, which is our medical program that's tied to the entitlement. Now, it's very common that folks will be on one set of programs or another, and it's also very common that folks will be on all four programs at the same time. So, with that, let's dive a little deeper, Diana, into public benefits.
Absolutely, Steve. So we're going to start with the needs-based benefits. And first, we're going to look at SSI. So there's a three-part test for SSI. The first part is meeting the definition of disability. The Social Security defines disability as somebody who is under the age of 65 and who cannot engage in substantial gainful employment or activities. We call that SGA because of physical or mental impairments that are expected to last a year or longer or end in death. So in 2025, the monthly SGA amount for non-blind individuals is $1,620 per month. The next part of the test is the income test, which determines how much of a benefit the individual can receive. Steve, can you go ahead and walk us through the income test?
So, when we're talking about SSI, there are three categories of income. So, the first category is unearned income. So, when somebody is on SSI, and if they receive any cash at all, and that can be from gifts, it could be from annuities, pensions, alimony, support payments, dividends, interest, rents, awards, or payments from any other benefit program, what happens is benefits are reduced dollar for dollar after the first $20. So an example might be that if you were to give a $100 gift to an SSI recipient, they wouldn't count the first $20, but they would reduce the benefits by $80 a month. And that kind of illustrates one of the problems with SSI is that you generally cannot give an SSI recipient cash. The other kind of income that we're just going to touch on today is earned income. Okay. So if you earn it, you lose $1 for every $2 you earn after the first $65. So an example would be, let's say in the month of May, you earn $265. They don't count the first $20, but the remaining $200, you would lose $1 for every $2 you earned. So your SSI would be reduced by $100 a month. Now you're still $165 ahead, but those are the general rules. Like to mention that there are all sorts of exceptions to these rules here, and working for persons with disabilities oftentimes is the road to independence, but the basic rule is you lose $1 for every $2 you earn after the first $65. The third type of income, which is going through a lot of changes, is sometimes the most perplexing, which is called in-kind support and maintenance. So what that is that SSI originally, when it was put together, was for food, clothing, and shelter. And it was literally, the federal part of the SSI is literally 1/3 for food, 1/3 for clothing, and 1/3 for shelter. Now they've eliminated the penalty for food and they've eliminated the penalty for clothing, but we still have the penalty for shelter. So if a person on SSI is getting assistance with their shelter, which includes utilities and that sort of thing, your benefits can be reduced by $242.33 in 2025, which is once again the 1/3 of the federal part of the SSI plus $20. Great. So,
Thanks. Thanks, Steve. The last part of the SSI test is the resource test to determine eligibility. So let's talk about resources. Resources are cash and anything that can be turned into cash. Examples include property, stocks, bonds, and bank accounts. Why are resources important for the SSI program? They're important because if an individual has resources more than $2,000 in an individual month for an individual or $3,000 for a couple, they can lose their benefits. So they're counted at the beginning of the calendar month, and that's when the eligibility determination will be made. There are countable resources, and then there are resources that are not countable. So what things don't count towards your resource limit? These include the home that you live in, one vehicle, household goods and personal effects, life insurance policies with a face value of $1,500 or less, burial plots or spaces for your immediate family, and burial funds up to $1,500, each for you and your spouse.
now one
So,
thing
Steve,
that's kind of unique about SSI is that California is what's called a categorically eligible state. So if an SSI recipient receives at least $1 of SSI, then they'll receive Medi-Cal without they'll still remain eligible for SSI Medi-Cal, and they'll get the Medi-Cal automatically. Now, because of time, we can't get really deep into this. And as we're talking about this, we're looking at a change if you're not on SSI in the Medi-Cal rules here as far as eligibility, as far as the resource limits. So it's important that if you're a Medi-Cal recipient or if the person is on Medi-Cal, we need to look at the current rules here, and it's important to understand that keeping that $1 of SSI is not the only way to keep Medi-Cal, and there are other ways to do that. But for many of the folks that Diane and I plan for, the Medi-Cal oftentimes will be the most important program that we're preserving.
So now we're going to look at the entitlements. We just went over the needs-based benefits. Now we're going to look at the entitlements. The entitlements include Social Security retirement, Social Security disability insurance, and the childhood disability benefit, which actually falls under SSDI. We will also briefly cover Medicare. With all of these benefit discussions, please know that we have additional resources on our website as well. As Steve mentioned, we're kind of running through this as fast as we can so that we can also address the planning tools that we have at the firm, but we want to just give you an overview of everything. So first, Social Security disability insurance. SSDI is a national program for injured workers that meet the required number of work credits to qualify. It has no income or resource limits, making it much more flexible than SSI. However, an individual's income can affect eligibility. Childhood disability benefits falls under Social Security. So if a child became disabled before turning 22 and has a parent who is receiving SSDI for retirement, or maybe the parent is disabled, they may qualify for childhood disability benefits. Upon the parent retiring or becoming eligible for disability benefits, the child will receive 1/2 of the parent's benefit. When that parent passes, or what we say in our office, when the parent gets eaten by a dinosaur, the child will receive 3/4 of the parent's SSA benefit. In order to qualify, The child must not have engaged in substantial gainful activities since the age of 18. And similar to SSDI, the benefit is not affected by the child's assets, but the child's income may result in a loss of the benefit. Steve, can you walk us through an example of the childhood disability benefits?
So
Oh,
as we go through this, and this is a really important program, especially for folks that are developmentally disabled, because by definition, to be developmentally disabled, you had to have had your condition before the age 18. And it's also important to note that the amount that the benefits recipient gets does not lower the amount that the parent receives. So this is on top of that. So let's just go through an illustration here. Let's say that Helen has been disabled from birth and is receiving $1,206.94 in SSI monthly. Her father, Earl, retires and receives $1,600 a month. Now, if we divide that $1,600 in half, then that's $800 a month. So the way that affects things here is that they don't count the first $20. It's called the $20 disregard here, but the remaining $780 here that she's receiving would be subtracted from her SSI, meaning at this point, she would get $402.94 in SSI and $800 in childhood disability benefits. But once again, in the situation when Earl passes away or is eaten by the dinosaur here, Helen begins to receive $1,200 a month. In this case, her SSI would be completely eliminated, assuming that I did the math correctly, but her Medi-Cal would be maintained if she is otherwise eligible. So currently, as we're doing this webinar, the resource limit for Medi-Cal is unlimited, but we just got the proposed budget that will put the Medi-Cal back to the $2,000 resource limit. So when we're talking about otherwise eligible, those rules are changing as we continue. But this is a really important program, especially for folks who were disabled before the age of 22. And this is a much friendlier program here than SSI.
and lastly, Medicare. Medicare is a federal health insurance program for people over 65 and people under 65 who are receiving Social Security based on a disability for 2 or more years. Persons can be eligible for both Medicare and Medi-Cal, as Steve mentioned previously. People can receive some of the benefits that we've discussed, or they can be receiving all 4 of the benefits we've discussed. Medi-Cal is a payer of last resort and also covers long-term care costs. So that's one difference between Medi-Cal and Medicare. So now that we've gone over the benefits, we are going to dive into the basics of special needs planning. What we're talking about today is third-party special needs trusts. Third-party trusts are established by someone other than the beneficiary. Examples include a parent, a grandparent, or a sibling. There is another kind of trust called a first-party trust, which we are not going to discuss today. But that is the type of trust that contains the payback provisions. The third-party trusts do not contain Medi-Cal payback provisions. Steve, can you walk us through a scenario that illustrates some of the challenges that arise for our clients?
Well, what I always like to keep in mind when we're doing this kind of planning is that situations change often. I've actually been doing this work as a lawyer for over 30 years and was involved in the disability community long before that. And I've seen lots of changes over time. So the way I like to illustrate this is consider, imagine that you have a daughter named Kathy, and let's say today that Kathy is on the autism spectrum. And as we all know, folks with disabilities are individuals. So just because Kathy has a diagnosis doesn't mean that she's not capable of taking care of herself. But let's just imagine in this case that Kathy is likely to need some sort of assistance for the rest of her life. So you come to Diana and her team and you put together this marvelous special needs trust, this third party special needs trust, or let's say you join a pool trust to provide her for her needs and her incapacity here. But let's say after you get it all set up, you are eaten by the dinosaur, you pass away, and the trust actually goes into administration. What are the challenges we're going to see? Well, a couple of things we're going to see, and we're seeing this right now, is benefit laws are going to change. No question about it. So if we do a trust that all it does is preserve eligibility for SSI in 2025, can we be certain that this is going to be do the job in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or 70 years? And the answer is absolutely not. So we better make sure that trust can adjust to any of those changes. Her social service systems will change. Now, if Kathy has a behavioral health or mental illness diagnosis here, we have certainly seen the mental health system collapse here and seen that system change, and California is trying to rebuild it. In California, we have the Lanterman system, which is arguably the best program in the country. But can we be certain, if she's developmentally disabled, that the Lanterman system will continue or provide the level of services we need? And the answer is no. Although I will mention the best chance of seeing that the Lanterman system won't collapse has to do with advocacy of parents and persons with disabilities. Her advocacy system will change. Oftentimes, the families that are setting up these trusts are the advocates. And so the job of this trust oftentimes is to try to keep up that advocacy as best we can over Kathy's lifetime. Attitudes about disabilities change wildly here. And we've seen this a lot with persons with disabilities. And hopefully, we see more and more inclusion of people with disabilities, but it's very possible it could go the other way. And we always have to be cognizant of this. Here's a question that Diana and I get all the time. And the answer is, how in the hell could we possibly know which is the amount of resources she needs may change? So oftentimes when you're doing your planning, you really need to consider that, possibly based on the system and the supports as they are today, we can pretty much guess how much the supports will continue going forward. But what if the system gets better? What if it gets worse? The fact is that we may need her needs as far as resources will likely change over time. So as we get a little deeper into this, I want you to keep this in mind. The Dale Law Firm and Diana and her drafting team are going to work with you as best we can to be able to meet these challenges and this. And many parents of disabled individuals go through a lifelong learning process about how to provide for the unique needs of their children or loved ones. But it's also very commonplace for parents to realize it's important to create the trust for their child's quality of life. But the creation of the document is too often seen as the objective rather than the goal to meet your objectives. Part of what the document does is it creates a system of to provide for distributions that the beneficiary needs, and it also provides a checks and balance system of accountability to make sure that quality of life is maintained. But keep this in mind, it's just a document. So a piece of paper is not going to be what protects your loved ones. But what the piece of paper does is it creates a system of advocacy and accountability to meet your objective, which should be to enhance the quality of life for a person with a disability, utilizing the benefits as a tool, but the benefits are just a tool and not the objective.
That's exactly right, Steve. A special needs trust should be a tool used to provide for the quality of life for the individual, establish a process of accountability, preserve public benefits when appropriate, and be tax wise when possible. The goal is quality of life. So I know that planning can be incredibly overwhelming. Our job is to break down the process into smaller steps, holding your hand through each part until we are able to produce a plan that meets your family's particular needs and achieves your long-term goals. We've broken this process down into 4 steps. So let's go ahead and jump into each one. The first step is to clearly express your intent. Why is expressing your intent so important? The trustee must comply with the intent of the grantor. You making this trust are the grantor. It's your intent that matters. A bare bones trust that only focuses on preserving benefits will lack the proper directions needed for a trustee to carry out their duties. Proper documentation of your intent will allow the trustee to understand your values and objectives. Steve, can you go ahead and explain how we express intent in the trust document versus the letter of intent?
This is really important. And I can't tell you how many times Diana and I review trusts where all they say is keep my child qualified for public benefits. And, if you really think about it, that's not really the objective. The special needs trust should have broad information about overall guidance to the trustee and advocates. So, usually in the trust, what we ask you to do is to work with Diane and her team to give a broad information about what we want this trust to accomplish. For instance, what kind of housing needs are we looking at? What are we looking at vocational needs? We're getting more and more folks that are saying that I want the trustee to do the best they can to help my child develop and maybe eventually get off of the public benefits and that sort of thing. But we generally put in broad information in the trust to kind of set the tone of what is it we want to accomplish. Now, digging deeper into this, it's tied into what's called the letter of intent, which is a separate document that you maintain where you can get more information here. I like to think of the letter of intent as kind of an ongoing journal. And I've had clients who keep this up over time. And so it'll have information in there about what medications are useful and what aren't. What kind of activities does my child really enjoy as they develop? Um, um, are there certain programs that have been really useful and things that have not? A lot of times, family members here, especially parents, have a lot of good information we want to pass on to that trustee so they can continue that advocacy even after you've passed away or you've been eaten by the dinosaur.
And intent is really important because the goal here is to avoid isolation, because isolation can lead to abuse and neglect. A major goal of most clients is to ensure that their loved one is still involved in their community. So, again, we'll use broad language in the trust to make sure that that intent is in there. But like Steve said, the letter of intent is also a wonderful way to list the organizations that your child likes to be involved in, list the friends, the family members. All of that information is important to ensure that your child stays involved in the community.
And let me mention this real quick. The movement from institutions in the community isn't merely moving from large institutions to isolated group homes, that kind of thing. Ideally, that means that the person with a disability becomes engaged in the community. That is true community living. And so, involvement with churches and synagogues or clubs or other organizations not only enhances their quality of life, but it lessens the chance of abuse or neglect, or at least makes it more detectable when it happens.
Absolutely. The next step is to choose a management system to carry out your intent. we're going to start first with the choice of trustee. So these are all potentials for who can be trustee of your child's trust. Oftentimes, clients initially want to appoint a family member as successor trustee. Though this is not impossible, we usually advise against appointing a family member if they're not sufficiently familiar with the complexities of benefits eligibility and services. However, that doesn't mean that family shouldn't be included. And in fact, family can play a supervisory role to ensure that your child is receiving the best quality of life. So here's a model of what that might look like. You could have a professional in the role of trustee, and we're going to get into some of those professionals in a second, but this could be a professional fiduciary, corporate trustee, or pooled trust. Your family then can either serve as the trust protector or advisory committee. Those are really the same thing. It's just if it's one person, it's called a trust protector. If it's more than one person, it's called the advisory committee. The advisory committee provides guidance to the trustee. The team can also consist of a care manager who would also provide guidance on what the beneficiary may need. So the first type of professional trustee that we consider is a private professional fiduciary. Private professional fiduciaries are often a great choice for trustee because of their experience. They will take care of the day-to-day work, including housing, medical needs, and financial services, including bill paying and investment management. In California, private professional fiduciaries are licensed professionals. Steve, can you go ahead and walk us through the other types of professional trustees?
Okay, so another trustee to consider is a corporate trustee or a bank. So there's a number of corporate trustees that will serve special needs trusts. Many of their minimums change, and we've seen a lot of changes over the decades here. So most have a minimum above $1 million or more. And so it's one thing that if you're naming a corporate trustee, that minimums often change. So it's best to check from time to time if you have named a corporate trustee or a bank. Another option is a pooled trust. Okay. So a pooled trust is a type of trust to benefits persons with disabilities by allowing them to maintain their SSI and Medi-Cal and other governmental benefits while also providing for their needs. This type of trust is managed by a nonprofit organization and combines the assets of multiple beneficiaries, although each beneficiary has a separate account within the trust, and their share of the trust can be accounted to the penny. The trust funds are used for investment and management purposes, and oftentimes a pooled trust can reduce overhead and expenses, thereby making more funds available to the beneficiary, right? So, as we're going to talk about, I believe later, a lot of what we've been doing is that the traditional way of joining a pooled trust is through a joinder agreement here, which is basically signing a contract to join the pooled trust. But the problem oftentimes is that often limits choices. More often than not, if there's a substantial amount of funds that are being left to the person with a disability, we actually recommend that you do an individual trust and have the pooled trust administer your individual trust. And there's a lot of advantages in doing that, not the least of which is the ability to have some sort of a mobility. If for some reason you need to move it from a pooled trust to other options. And it's always good to keep your options open.
Absolutely. And that leads into our next point, which is all about flexibility. As we've discussed already, there are a lot of different challenges that may change. We don't know what the future holds with regards to benefits, with regards to the needs of your loved ones. So we want to make sure that the document provides flexibility and is able to adapt to those changing needs. One of the ways we do this is with what's called an opt-out clause. So if you did want to name a family member as trustee, you can name that family member, and then we can also include language that allows the family member to step down and become either a trust protector or part of the advisory committee. And then they would oversee a professional trustee, whether that be a private professional fiduciary, corporate trustee, or pooled trust. What this does is it allows the family member to manage it if they're able to, but also allows them to still be involved if the day-to-day management of it becomes too much for them. So let's talk a little bit about advisory committees and trust protectors. Like I said, a trust protector and advisory committee are pretty much the same thing. It's just when there's one person, it's called a trust protector, and when there's more than one person, it's an advisory committee. The basic concept is that the advisory committee is meant to provide a system of checks and balances. They can check in with the trustee. They can provide guidance to the trustee on the beneficiary's needs, their interests. Oftentimes a trustee is going to create a distribution plan at the beginning of the year. What this is a budget. The trust advisory committee can review that. They can add things like, my child really loves swimming. Let's make sure there's a plan in place to allow them to continue their swimming program. So that is the guidance they can provide to the trustee, but they also do provide that checks and balances. So if something were going wrong with the trustee, oftentimes the advisory committee has the power to remove and replace that trustee. A care manager can also be part of your team. So a care manager can assist in coordinating services for the beneficiary, often identifying issues such as over-medication, safety issues, or caregiving issues. And depending on who the care manager is, they can also provide benefits analysis. All of these roles together, the trustee, the advisory committee, the care management, this is the system that Steve was alluding to earlier. The document itself is not magic, but the systems in place allow for the continued growth and flexibility that provide for the quality of life of the beneficiary. The third step is funding the trust. So funding the trust means moving assets into the trust. When we talk about funding the trust, for example, with a revocable living trust, you during your lifetime as the parents usually have a revocable living trust, and you will fund your assets into that trust. When you get eaten by the dinosaur, those assets, whether it's all of them or a certain percentage of them, would then be distributed and funded into the third-party special needs trust. For most assets, this is a pretty straightforward process. For example, when you're funding checking accounts, savings accounts, and non-retirement accounts into the trust, into your living trust, it's usually just a matter of going to the bank and updating the name on the account. It's a very similar process to when you get married. And again, those assets will go from that living trust and pour into the third-party special needs trust. There are a couple of unique assets that we also discuss during our planning process. The first are qualified plans. Qualified plans are retirement plans. So they include things like 401ks, defined benefits plans, pension plans, profit sharing plans, and money purchase pension plans. There are a couple things that are unique about the retirement plans that we're going to get into in a second, but one thing to keep in mind when you're planning for retirement plans. I just talked about moving assets into the revocable trust so that they can pour into the third-party special needs trust. Retirement plans do not go into your revocable trust during your lifetime. Instead, On the retirement plans, you will name beneficiaries. So you do that through the institution that holds the retirement plan. For example, if it's an IRA, you might go to Fidelity and update your beneficiary designation form. When we're thinking about retirement plans, we do have to consider tax implications on how we plan for them. And there have been recent changes in the tax law as it regards to inherited retirement plans. There was first the Secure Act, and then there was the Secure Act 2.0. And I know it's thrown a lot of people for a loop because it's really changed the rules. Previously, inherited retirement plans were distributed over the lifetime of a beneficiary. So if a child who is 25 inherited the plan, they could take minimum distributions based on their life expectancy, thus spreading out the distributions and minimizing the income tax that is required to be paid with each withdrawal. That is no longer the rule. Now, most beneficiaries have to withdraw the funds over a 10-year period. Now, I do say most because there are exceptions, and this is what we want to plan for when we're discussing this with you. But most, meaning children who are neurotypical, will have to withdraw it over, and who are over the age of 21 will have to withdraw it over 10 years. There is an exception for disabled individuals. So here's a chart that really sums it up. We're kind of going to ignore the non-designated beneficiaries. This would be a non-person beneficiary. What we really focus on are people. So a designated beneficiary would be a neurotypical child. They will have to take out the funds in the retirement plan over 10 years. A spouse can use their life expectancy. So this could allow for a longer stretch of those retirement benefits. Also, an SNT trust for a disabled or chronically ill person can also use the life expectancy rules. And this is where we really hone in with our clients when we're planning. As I tell my children who are 3 and 5, fair does not mean same. So when we're planning for if you have multiple children, fair doesn't mean that they're inheriting the same assets. And if you do have substantial retirement accounts, it may make more sense for your child with the disability to receive those retirement benefits than it would to have your other children receive those benefits. Again, it's not only that your child with the disability can stretch it over their lifetime. It's also that they probably have costs that are going to mitigate that income tax that is owed on the withdrawals. And they will also probably be in a lower tax bracket. All of this combined will likely result in less taxes paid and more cash in the pocket of your child. So Steve is going to walk us through an example of this so you can see the numbers to see what it looks like.
And hopefully this will help with this. And as Diana was saying, we get all the time. We had a client yesterday that said they had two things they wanted to do. They wanted to be fair to their children, so they had a child with a disability and child without here, and they wanted to treat them equal. And what they assumed that we would suggest is to take all the assets and split them in half. Well, first off, there's nothing fair about being a family member, but that's a whole different subject. And secondly, children are not equal. And so oftentimes there'll be one asset that might be better off in the hands of one child and assets that might be better off in the hands of another. So in this scenario, let's say that the parents here have twin daughters here, and one daughter has a significant disability and will need assistance for the rest of her life. but otherwise has a normal life expectancy here. And the provisions of their trust says to equal shares remaining of the estate to each daughter. So the daughter with the disability, her assets are going to go in a standalone third party trust, with the daughter without the disability being the remainderment. So the assets that we're dealing with in this situation is $500,000 in an IRA, $500,000 in a life insurance policy, and investments worth about $500,000, which will qualify for the step up bid basis, meaning that after the parents pass away, those assets get revalued at date of death value. And if they were sold the day after, there would be no capital gains tax paid. As far as tax brackets, let's say the daughter with the disability is in the 12% tax bracket, and the daughter without the disability is in the 32% tax bracket. And we'll assume that all the third party specialties trust income passes out to the daughter with the disability viable distributions in what we call distributable net income. Okay, so let's see how this plays out. Let's say with this that looking at the funds here that go into the third party trust, for that daughter, because she's disabled, it can stretch out over the lifetime of the beneficiary, which in this case, her life expectancy is expected to be 32.2 years upon the date of the parent's death in this scenario, meaning that the minimum here that has to be taken out is $13,000 the first year. And if the taxes were paid at the beneficiary's tax level without even considering any deductible expenses and that kind of thing, we're talking about $1,657 a year in taxes the first year. For the daughter without the disability, if she were to receive the retirement plan here, then she would only have 10 years to take it out. Now, you don't have to take it out in equal payments, but if you did at $50,000 a year, her taxes would be $16,000 a year. Clearly, for tax planning purposes, that qualified plan, that IRA, would be better off designated to the special needs trust here. And part of what this doesn't illustrate here is that in most cases, if the funds are used to pay for things that are medically related, like attended care and that kind of thing, oftentimes there'll be no taxes paid at all because they're deductible at the beneficiary's tax rate. Now, I know for folks that are not tax persons, this may seem very complicated, but the point of the whole thing is by doing some strategic planning here, not only can we use this trust to enhance the quality of life for a beneficiary, but we can also use this as a tax planning tool. So looking at this as far as equal treatment, if it goes in the third party trust here for the daughter with the disability, it can be taken out over her lifespan. But for the daughter without the disability, it has to be withdrawn within 10 years after she reaches the age of maturity. For the daughter with the disability, income passes out of the trust to be taxed at the lower level here at the beneficiary level, because oftentimes you hear about how these trusts pay what's called the compressed tax rate or a higher tax rate. Well, that's only if you don't distribute out the income to the beneficiary, and a knowledgeable trustee is not going to let that happen. For the daughter without the disability, it's going to be taxed at her personal income rate. For the once again, for the daughter with the disability, oftentimes the income is offset by deductions here. Once again, for the daughter without the disability, she would need to itemize her deductions to be able to do that. The effect of it being able to be taken over a longer period is that for the daughter with the disability here, it's going to be able to grow in that tax-free environment here, and it'll grow at a faster rate and be able to provide more assistance, whereas for the daughter without the disability, it would have to be taken out over 10 years. Now, when it comes to the life insurance here, life insurance is tax-free. And so for the daughter without the disability, wouldn't you think she'd rather have that tax-free income rather than getting a qualified plan where she's going to have to be taxes? Whereas it would be tax-free if it went into the special needs trust. But I just want to tell you, in the actual administration of these trusts, most of the trusts that I see, there are so many deductible expenses. We don't really need tax-free income. For investments, that gets what's called a step up in basis here, which is a revaluation of date of death for capital gains tax purposes. And that's treated much the same. But one last tax advantage that the Special Needs Trust has is that it qualifies for what's called the Qualified Disability Trust Exemption, which in 2026 is $5,000. So the trust itself gets a $5,000 exemption right off the bat. And of course, the daughter without the disability does not get that. Part of the whole point of this is by doing strategic planning. And oftentimes, Diana will work with your financial advisor to try to strategically plan. Not only can this trust provide a quality of life for the beneficiary, it can also become a great tax planning tool.
Absolutely. And I just want to take us back to the scenario again. As Steve mentioned, if the daughter without the disability is inheriting half of the IRA, she's going to pay significant taxes on it, but she wouldn't pay any taxes on the life insurance. So in this situation, it may make sense to leave the IRA to the daughter with the disability and the life insurance to the daughter without the disability. Now, I know that's not a 50-50 split, but that is how we use tax planning to get the most out of it while trying to be quote unquote fair.
So I know the degree
Another,
we're going to go to, and I know Diana, I would say, I would think you'd agree with me. The single greatest issue we deal with our beneficiaries really is, where will my child live? And I know that's really oftentimes the focus of our discussions. So
absolutely. Real property, homes are really important to plan for. So providing a residence for your child with a disability is one of the greatest challenges that families face, and it's one of the challenges that families are most concerned about solving for. In the right situation, providing a house for your loved one with a disability can provide a foundation for the best possible quality of life for that individual. But everyone is unique and everyone has different long-term goals and different needs. So we do discuss various different options in terms of housing, and together we can come up with the best solution. There are challenges when it comes to housing. Some of these challenges include not having enough funds to cover the expenses of maintaining the house. These expenses can include maintenance. For example, if a new roof is needed, that could be $20,000, but also taxes, and specifically property taxes. A few years ago, Prop 19 was passed, which changed how property taxes are reassessed when there is a transfer between a parent and a child. In order for the child to inherit their parent's property tax basis, the child has to live in the home. Now, if you only have one child and that's your child with the disability and you plan for them to be in that home, that works well. They'll be able to receive your property tax basis and therefore lower that cost and that challenge when it comes to maintaining the house. However, there might be multiple children, and this is an issue that Steve and I discuss with clients all the time. What is the best way for your children to inherit that house? Is it best for it to go to the third party special needs trust for your child with the disability to live there so that property taxes do not jump? Or maybe the house is not going to be a suitable living space for the child with the disability once you're gone, and you want to leave it to all the kids so that they can sell it, and then proceeds can be used for your child with the disability to find appropriate housing. This is a big discussion, and again, an area where we have the challenge of both being fair and also making sure that each of your children has what they need. And what they need may not be equal amounts. Other challenges when it comes to property include property management issues, attendant care issues, and the possibility for isolation. Sometimes it might be best to have your child in a living situation where they can engage with others to ensure they're not isolated. Supported living services and independent living services can also help. Ultimately, we want to be able to discuss these challenges with you and come up with a plan that is going to meet the goals and unique needs of your family. Our last step is determining where the funds ultimately go. I know it's really difficult to think about as a parent, but the dinosaurs come for everyone. So at some point, the dinosaur will come and eat your child. So what if there are assets remaining in the trust, what do you want to do with them? We have a few different options. The first is what's called a power of appointment. So if you want your child to have the ability to give assets to who they want to give to, you would allow them a power of appointment. They can exercise this to give to anyone or to a limited scope of people. So you might specify that your child can give the assets to family members, to spouses, to their children. Or you can have it open-ended and they can leave it to anyone except for themselves or their estate. If you don't want to give them the power of appointment, that's fine. We don't have to do that. If you give them the power of appointment, we also need to plan for what if they don't exercise it. So whether or not you're giving them the power of appointment, we also need to specify where you would want the assets to go if you had to decide. So this can include other family members and friends, or it can include charities. And Steve, I know you work with a lot of various charities in this space. So can you take a moment to hit on that?
Well, I would say this is an area where I know a lot of the families and persons with disabilities we deal with, their life has been so enhanced by organizations like the ARC or NAMI or the Autism Society or any of these different groups. And so, just as you're doing your planning, seriously consider supporting those organizations that have supported your family and so many others. And even the smallest donation to these organizations can do so much good. And especially with the economy as it is today, seriously consider that if you can, consider supporting those organizations that support our community here. So once again, something that oftentimes in the rush of all the planning we kind of forget, but it's something we like to bring top of mind.
Absolutely. So some last thoughts. Ideally, when we are going through this process together, again, I know it can seem overwhelming, but we are here to go through each one of those 4 steps with you. In the ideal world, you'll help us understand your family and child's unique needs and in turn will guide you through the legal options available. I know we touched on a few different options in this presentation. Again, we have options and flexibility to meet your specific needs. Together, we'll craft a personalized plan that reflects your long-term goals and ensures lasting support and quality of life for your child. The administration of a special needs trust can be a long-term commitment, sometimes 70 years plus. The documents need to be flexible to deal with issues that may present themselves over that period of time. Sometimes this might be even unexpected challenges. We do want to be aware of making requirements that may be difficult or impossible to carry out. When Steve was talking earlier about setting out your intention in the trust versus the letter of intent, it really brings into frame this point. We want to use broad language in the trust so that the trustee is not handcuffed and can continue to act in the best interest for your child. Then in the letter of intent, that's where you can get specific and provide as much information and guidance as you need and continually update it as your family grows. As we discussed, the choice of trustee and the management system is one of the greatest factors about whether a special needs trust will succeed or fail. I look at this as a team management. You have the trustee. They are going to be the point person and in charge. They are going to be handling the day-to-day tasks. But they're going to get guidance from the advisory committee and possibly a care manager. Everyone works together to ensure that your child maintains that quality of life. So those are our final points. We do also have more information. Steve, do you want to hit on some of the other places you can?
Well, a couple of things before we go to questions and answers is that as with everything with disability, the more you learn, the more you prepare, the better advocate you're going to be. So these are different websites, both the Golden State Pool Trust website, the Achieving Independence website, Dale Law Firm, and we do have a very active YouTube channel, which has a lot of useful information. One thing, Diana, before we go to what I consider the most terrifying part of this presentation, which is taking the questions here, is let's just take a minute and talk about the process. As we had talked about as we got started, we have a team at the Dale Law Firm and we have a process, and we do our best to really strictly adhere to that. So part of this is if you decide to work with us, we have an intake team that we work with, and so they're going to gather as much information as possible before it actually lands on Diana's desk. Secondly, with that, you'll receive a short, much shorter video that explains how to fill out the intake sheet and what is the goal. Why are we asking these questions? Part of this is by having this all in order and thinking about these things ahead of time. Diana and her team can do a very personalized planning for your loved one. And there's two things we're looking for. Part of what we're looking for is to learn from you about what your objectives are, and then Diana and her team working with you to be able to create a plan that meets those goals. But the second part of it is this is somewhat of a learning process. And ideally, when the plan is over, if you break this into a step-by-step process, not only should you have a plan that meets your objectives, but it should be a plan that you can understand, and except for the boilerplate in the trust, be able to explain it to others so they can understand how this checks and balance system works to achieve what we're all looking for, is to use this as a tool to enhance the quality of life for persons with disabilities living in the community. Any last thoughts, Diana? And then we will go to the most terrifying part of the program, which is, Amy, do we have any questions?
One last thought, just adding on to that, it really is important that you understand these documents. I can't tell you how many times I talk to friends or family members who've created a trust and they have no idea what it does. And so it is my goal to ensure that all of your questions are answered and that we have walked through the provisions together to ensure that you understand how it works together. So know that I truly am holding your hand through this process to ensure that you are educated and making informed decisions that ultimately reach your goals.
So, Amy,
Okay, first question. Is it possible to provide for the needs of my 35-year-old son who is on SSDI and Medi-Cal without using a special needs trust and still maintain the Medi-Cal, Medicare, SSDI eligibility? I had heard that Medi-Cal now does not have an assets test. I have concerns about the rules for administering a special needs trust. And if you will allow me, I can actually add some insight here because we set up a special needs trust for our son before he was on SSDI. And one of the major objectives is that he wouldn't lose his benefits. Well, now he's on SSDI. He doesn't really need the special needs trust anymore in order because he doesn't have the issues with the asset tests. But as you've said, Steve, and I'm sure you'll add to this, is that a special needs trust is not just for maintaining benefits, and that our son, and it could be different for this person, but he needs the special needs trust for providing his quality of life later on down the line when I'm not around to make sure that his needs are being met. I need a fiduciary and a care manager to do those things that I do now.
great. Well, just building on that, and by the way, for those of you who don't know who Amy Tesler is our education and outreach coordinator and helps make sure that our programs operate on time and that kind of thing. And that relieves us a lot. So there's a couple of things with this. Specifically for the question. The question was, do I need a special needs trust now while I'm alive to achieve these objectives for my child who's receiving these different benefits? And packed into that question is something that's going on right now, which is we just received the governor's proposed budget, which is going to change the Medi-Cal rules back to where they've been for decades and decades and decades. So for the last couple of years, the resource limit has been eliminated for Medi-Cal, but it's about to be reinstated unless there's a major change in the law, which kind of illustrates what we had talked about, that laws and benefits do change. Now, going back specifically to this, while you are alive, your assets, once your child becomes an adult, are not deemed or attributable to your child. So you can actually benefit your child the same way that a special needs trust can benefit. And you can do that without a special needs trust. Where the special needs trust may come in is it's a little difficult to do that after you've been eaten by the dinosaur. In fact, we haven't figured out how to do that. So the special needs trust can become your alter ego to maintain those payments, maintain that support without interfering with their benefits.
Yeah, and to add on to both of that, Amy makes a very good point, and as Steve and I also emphasize, the special needs trust is not just to maintain the benefits, it's really to set up that support system and ensure that those systems can grow with your child. That said, again, we want to create unique plans for your individual family. And if there is a future that could involve your child not needing benefits, then one of the things we can work into the trust is an early termination clause. For example, if your child is able to work and is no longer receiving benefits for a period of 3 years, the trustee has an option to terminate the special needs trust. So again, I wish I knew the future. If I did, I'd be a very rich woman. I don't. And so that's the point of having these discussions with us, ensuring that we're providing the flexibility to meet your specific goals. No
Is the
problem.
Secure 2.0 specific to IRAs or also applicable to pensions, 401ks, and so on?
It's applicable to 401ks. Pensions are usually have different rules. And Steve, I know we discuss CalPERS at length, but usually you elect when you're choosing the pension to use it over your lifetime or your lifetime and then your spouse's lifetime. And then there is a third possibility to use it over your lifetime, spouse's lifetime, and disabled child's lifetime. So pensions are a little bit different.
But the typical programs, which would be your 401k or your IRA, you can designate the special needs trust. And also, oftentimes, what we'll suggest you do is if you are a married couple, to designate your spouse as the first beneficiary and the trust as the secondary beneficiary. That actually opens up some possibilities because it's not uncommon after the first spouse passes away that the surviving spouse is in a high tax bracket and may not need all that taxable income. And by disclaiming the funds, meaning saying, I don't want it, then it'll go wherever the beneficiary designation says. And if it says the special needs trust, this could be a good planning tool between the first parent's death and the second parent's death to do some tax planning to divert those funds to the child with a disability. And, part of the plan that we build and Diana and her team focus on is working in as many different options as we can, because once again, it's all about options in the end.
Absolutely.
Okay, next question. So does the RMD income pass through from the SNT impact SSI / Medi-Cal benefits?
Again, this is where you're going to want to make sure that you have a trustee who is educated and knows how to manage the trust. No, it should not, so long as the trustee is managing it correctly.
So let me illustrate how this works. Let's say you have a child with a disability, and I know it's very common that the child may be getting IHSS, which is attendant care in California paid by Medi-Cal, and it's almost always inadequate. So let's say on top of that, the trust is paying for additional attendant care, which, by the way, in most cases is going to be a deductible expense to the beneficiary. So let's say in this example that the distribution we take out for the year is $30,000, and that's all taxable income. Now, if you just left it in the trust, here it's going to be taxed what's called the compressed tax rate at the highest level possible. But let's say instead the trust turns around and pays, in this case, $25,000 in attendant care costs. Now, what happens? The trust qualifies for a $5,000 qualified disability trust exemption, and then that the amount that was used to pay for the attendant care is not counted as income to the beneficiary because the beneficiary did not receive cash. But on the other hand, the beneficiary did receive a benefit, so that taxable income is going to flow through to the benefits recipient, to the beneficiary, and without interfering with their public benefits. And in this case, if it's used for attendant care, after the 10% floor, that would all be a deductible expense. And there's a very big possibility that there would be no taxes paid at all. But as Diana had mentioned, this is where planning and a knowledgeable trustee is so important, because in many cases, you can use this to zero out the taxes. If you have somebody who really doesn't understand this, they could end up paying a higher trust rate than our president.
So yes, having a knowledgeable trustee, but also having a good team behind you. We like to think of ourselves as part of your trusted advisors, but a good CPA is also very important.
That's an important part of the team.
Yeah.
Okay. What are the pros and cons of whether to directly name the beneficiary of my IRA 401k as my disabled adult versus naming the trust with special needs provision for their benefit? Don't both scenarios allow for the life expectancy treatment for down of RMDs, to draw down the RMDs?
They both do allow for that stretch. However, we have to consider other factors as well. Because if your child was to inherit it outright, it would disqualify them from needs-based benefits. That, and if it's in the trust, the trustee can help manage it for them. So if your child is not capable of managing funds effectively, having that trustee guidance is going to be really important. So yes, the RMD stretch is the same, but how it's managed and how it affects benefits, that's where it's going to matter.
Oh, by the way, for folks who have no idea what an RMD is, what is an RMD?
Required minimum distribution. So it's the minimum amount that a person, an inheriting beneficiary, has to take out each year. And the reason that it's important is, as we illustrated in the example, if I'm only taking out $1,500 a year, the tax on that is most likely going to be lower, if anything, than if I'm having to take out $50,000 a year. So,
Question, can you take out more than the minimum?
yes, you can.
So minimum means minimum. And then there was something else packed into this question, which maybe opens up another door. You could do this through a subtrust in a living trust, but that's not how we do it. We do an individual trust. Why?
Good question. So, there's two main reasons. First, um, when you get eaten by a dinosaur, we do have to report to the Social Security Administration, and they can get confused if it is a subtrust within a larger trust. So having a standalone trust is going to be simpler for them to digest. Secondly, people sometimes want to give to the special needs trust. So having the standalone trust for a grandparent to leave something to is also helpful.
It would
But
be a
keep in
great
mind,
tool for coordinating gifts.
right, exactly.
I'll tell you, there's another thing that comes up too, because in California, anybody who's named in any trust, remainder beneficiary, whatever, have a right to receive a copy of that trust. If the special needs trust is embedded in your living trust, if it's a subtrust, you're sharing a lot of personal information with all sorts of folks. By limiting it to an individual trust, we're limiting who's going to have access to that information.
Okay, and then the second part of that question is, and what if a currently disabled adult child becomes capable to work and no longer qualifies for SSDI/Medicare? What happens to the inherited IRA life expectancy rule in that scenario? Does it ever revert to the 10-year rule?
I actually, I don't believe so. But, I'm actually not clear on this. The rule basically is that you have to have the level of disability very similar to Social Security, which is the inability to earn substantial gainful activity or perform substantial gainful activity um, here. So this may be something I'll have to look up. So I may be stumped on this.
Okay, so we'll follow up on that one. Is it your intent that you intend to work as a resource for estate planning attorneys, similar to how Kraus Financial works with attorneys?
I'm not sure.
I
Uh,
am an attorney.
yeah, I'm not sure who Kraus Financial is. So the Dale law firm, we're all attorneys, but or Steve and I are attorneys, but we can work with other attorneys as well. We always like to say we play nice. So if you had a living trust created by another attorney and you're now looking to just do the special needs trust, a lot of estate planning practitioners will not do a special needs planning because it does really require an intimate deep knowledge of benefits and various other aspects. So they will oftentimes refer to us. And so what we will do is create that third party standalone trust and then also advise your current attorney on how to modify the living trust so that the two can work together. The way we modify it is called bridge language. We are bridging the gap between the trusts. But yes, we work well with other attorneys and are happy to do that.
Specific for this question, Kraus Financial is a financial organization that specializes in doing this kind of work. And there are other organizations such as Merrill Lynch has a special needs trust division.
Wells Fargo.
TrueLink Financial does as well. And so in many cases, there are these because another important part of the team are the financial advisors and the tax professionals, because in many ways, the way that our trust sets up is that the best practice is to have an annual distribution plan, basically a budget, and then that budget is put in front of the financial advisor, a group like Kraus Financial Advisors or Merrill Lynch or TrueLink, or there are other groups, and then they can form a portfolio around that. Now, this is just my thinking. They are part of the team, whereas you don't let the benefits drive the truck. We should also be really careful not to have the investment drive it as well. That these need to enhance the plan and work with the plan, so we're not working around these things, but a knowledgeable investment advisor and a knowledgeable CPA can really help here, not only make sure that we are able to enhance the quality of life here of the person with the individual, but also get the best investment and the best tax result.
Absolutely.
I think we can take a couple of more questions.
Okay, here's one. Our son has psychological issues that preclude him from providing for himself economically. We have set up a trust for him in our estate plan that will be administered by a bank trustee and have also included a letter of intent. He does not receive any government benefits. Are there any advantages for us to set up a special needs trust?
Couple things when we're looking at this, because going back to the theme that benefits should not be the sole focus, and keeping in mind also that persons with disabilities are unique individuals. I mean, it would be a lot simpler for Diana and I if they were all the same, but that they simply are not. But part of the other thing that these trusts are is they're a form of what's called a spendthrift trust, meaning that the money is for the benefit of the person with the disability, but they don't own it. And so, for instance, creditors cannot get their hands on this, and this is all protected from creditors and predators and that kind of thing. And that also oftentimes can be a huge thing. Now, a couple things when we're looking at a situation like this, we don't have to call it a special needs trust quite often. In fact, Diana and I met with a client yesterday where we're going to just call it Judy's trust, right? Or we can call it Judy's discretionary trust. We can name it anything we like here, and it may be that in format we want the trust to be to serve as a spendthrift trust, and it could be that benefits is not really the focus, But the format of the special needs trust is a good format in a situation like this. So typically when we get a situation like this in format, it's going to be a special needs trust here. But in reality, here we may call it something quite different.
Right. And then the other thing that we work with a number of different advisors. One in particular is very good at looking at the needs of the beneficiary and doing a benefits analysis. He may not be receiving benefits now, but if he's under 65 and unable to engage in substantial gainful activity, something to look at. So we also make referrals to other professionals that can help with that.
Okay.
I saw something about an ABLE account. Did I?
Yeah, it actually went into the chat, but I was going to mention that you might want to touch on the differences between CalAble or just ABLE accounts in general and special needs trusts.
If you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see tons and tons and tons hours of videos on ABLE accounts. But let me see if I can do this in a couple of minutes. ABLE accounts are great tools, and they can work very well with a special needs trust here. So there's a couple of things you can use an ABLE account for. And for those of you that haven't heard of an ABLE account, first off, I'm not sure how that could happen, but an ABLE account is something that's authorized under federal law, administered by state agencies here, and it allows you to put up to the amount of whatever the gift tax exclusion is in that trust annually. So currently that's $19,000 a year here, and it can go into this trust, and it does a couple of unique things. One is it is not to be counted for any of the needs-based benefits. So that includes SSI, it includes Medi-Cal, Medicaid in other states. It also includes HUD and other programs like that. So it has a lot of advantages in that situation. It um, it also can be used for housing without taking that exemption that we had talked about in the program. And the specifics of that is pretty well documented in our YouTube videos. A lot of people look at it as a substitute for a special needs trust, and maybe in some limited situations it can service that. I find it oftentimes as an enhancement to the special needs trust. The Social Security, and this also works for Medi-Cal, had actually made a ruling a number of years ago that transfers from a special needs trust into an ABLE account is perfectly okay. So, for instance, at the Golden State Pool Trust, where I am the trustee, we have a number of folks who have ABLE accounts. And what we're able to do is transfer up to $19,000 a year into the ABLE account, and then the beneficiary can use those funds as they please. One of the burdens, one of the jobs of the trustee, especially if somebody is on SSI, is they have to account for every expenditure, because if they get audited, Social Security is going to want to check to make sure that you're not using it for shelter without taking the reduction, and you're not giving them cash. Whereas if you transfer the funds into an ABLE account, the beneficiary is able to use it for whatever they like. So oftentimes it's a good tool to be used for discretionary spending here, so they can have some privacy in making some distributions themselves. The other thing is, and I'm probably, this is about as far as I'm going to go today on this, is that the other thing that the ABLE account rules of the ABLE account that people should be aware of is that the assumption is that the beneficiary is to be in control of that account unless they're incompetent or they don't have capacity here or they're underage. Now, in many cases, that is absolutely okay, but just keep in mind if you have a child or somebody who's the beneficiary of that trust where they are competent, but there's a danger that they're going to use the funds in a harmful way, or that they may be subject to undue influence, you might be really want to be really careful about how much you put in that trust. I use ABLE accounts more as a mode of distributions, transferring the funds in the ABLE account and allowing the person with the disability to make the choices themselves about how to use the funds, if that's appropriate in that case. I see it less useful as a substitute for estate planning, although you can certainly do that. Just always keep in mind, it can be a good thing or a bad thing that the trust in the end, or the ABLE account in the end, is to be controlled by the beneficiary themselves unless they totally lack capacity or they're a minor.
And just one other thing that I don't think we mentioned was that with the ABLE account, you can only save currently $19,000 a year. So if you've got a lot of money that you want to leave to your child, that wouldn't be an option.
And this might be a good place for us to end today because this kind of illustrates something. You know, one of my favorite sayings is that disability and simple are two words that don't go together. And I know a lot of these concepts are sometimes hard to get your head around. But if you think of this as a process, you know, and this is part of what Diane and the team work on, and you handle this step by step, this is something that's totally achievable. Dan, I'm going to give you the last word, and then I think it's time for lunch.
Can I have a last word too, Steve?
Well, okay.
Amy, I'll give you the last word.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you spending the time with us today. There are more resources on the website, and like Steve said, we are creating a process. We are holding your hand through it. And ultimately, our goal is to provide peace of mind that your loved ones are taken care of as you would hope for. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Amy.
Okay, two quick things. This webinar is going to be put up on our website. So if you want to hear it again, you can. It'll be probably a few days. So if you came late, a couple of you people mentioned that you were late, you can watch it from the beginning and listen to all this all over again. The second thing is there is a typo on this last slide. Our website is dalelawfirm.com, not .org. And the last thing I'll mention is that I went to work for the Dale Law Firm about, I guess it's been 5+ years ago. And when I first heard this webinar for the first time, I was overwhelmed and it was so confusing. And it was like, how am I ever going to figure all this stuff out? Well, 5 years later, after hearing this webinar, probably 25+ times, I actually understand this stuff. So it is possible. It is possible. And so don't beat yourself up if you listen to this and say, this is just crazy. I can never figure this out, because you can. Just take it little chunks at a time.
Anyway, I want to thank you folks for attending. And with that, happy advocating.